Kabbalistic Varia on the importance of marginal Kabbalah for medieval Jewish intellectual history. And we're having a handout.
So thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to speak in English. Believe me, your ability to understand English is, I'm sure, better than my spoken Hebrew, so thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, by the way. I've had students, undergraduate students from Muhlenberg who have come to Ben-Gurion, but this is my first chance to visit, so it's really a pleasure to be here. What I want to talk about today are marginal Kabbalistic texts. And their potential significance for the study of late 13th and early 14th century Kabbalah, as well as for their potential importance in terms of our knowledge of medieval intellectual history. The reason why I call these texts marginal is for a couple of reasons. First, they're mostly anonymous. All of the texts that I'm thinking about are unpublished. Some of them are short compositions that have no title. Others are actually very long compositions that in some cases have a title and in some cases do not. But there are a large number of these texts. In fact, so many, I'm not even sure how many different texts we have. There are so many of them. And they fit into a few basic groups. One of the largest groups is commentaries on the 10 Sfirot. The Perushei Eser Sfirot. Gershom Scholem, somewhat famously, almost 100 years ago, wrote a sort of short, he called it a Mafteach LePerushei Eser Sfirot, where there are over 120-some commentaries that he collected. The number is actually much larger than that. Texts that were not cataloged by Scholem, other texts that Scholem cataloged that actually are different texts from each other. So we really have many, many compositions of this kind. Others are collections of sodot. There are some manuscripts that attribute these sodots, in some cases to Gigatila, in some cases to De Leon, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they actually appear to be other collections of sodot that are not attributed to those authors. So there are many, many collections like this. Sfirot commentaries are connected to sodot in some cases in the manuscripts, so these are not always distinct compositions from one another. But these are basic groupings of texts. And the other group, I guess I would call short compositions that fit no category. They're sometimes just called in the catalogs that it's a Mamar al-HaKabbalah. So these are texts that really don't have an easy way to list them or to figure out how to place them within the spectrum of Jewish literature and the spectrum of medieval Kabbalistic literature. And I refer to this presentation as one that addresses Kabbalistic Varia, because in some of the catalogs, these Kabbalistic texts, which are often found together in a codex, are cataloged as Kabbalistic Varia, which I guess is Latin for random Kabbalah. Their texts are interesting, and they're also problematic. So in terms of studying late 13th and early 14th century Kabbalah, these are the most problematic kinds of sources that I work with. So I wanted to talk about these today because they raise interesting questions, and they raise important methodological difficulties for working with these kinds of materials. Now, dating and locating these texts. This is the first of the most important problems with these texts. Where are they written and when are they written? Scholem generally dated most of this kind of Kabbalistic literature, at least the ones that have been cataloged. He said that they are late 13th century, probably Castile. It's hard to say, since we have very few manuscripts where the copy of the manuscript dates to the late 13th century. There are a few important examples. Parma 1290 dates to the year 1286. It contains some important Kabbalistic Varia. One very, very famous medieval text that still remains unpublished is a short text called Ma'amar Klal Echad Me'inyan HaKabbalah. And sometimes this is just referred to as a Ma'amar al-HaKabbalah. Sometimes it's referred to as a commentary, a Perush on the Eser Sfirot. This exists in hundreds of manuscripts. And the earliest witness we have is Parma 1290, from the year 1286. There's also a commentary by Yaakov ben Yaakov HaKohen on the Sfirot from this period. And these are some early witnesses that we have that this kind of Kabbalah was being written in the 1280s. But we have very few manuscripts that are that old. Most of our manuscripts are from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. So what do we make of this evidence? Can we say that the complexity and the spectrum of discourse presented in these texts reflects the kind of very complex Kabbalah that was being disseminated in late 13th century Spain? Or is this the result of later scribal additions that have expanded and augmented these texts? And really we're seeing a much longer history that's much more difficult to locate. I think it's very hard to say. I think Daniel Abrams cautioned that we have to be aware of how open the medieval book was, and that these texts were always being rewritten as they were being copied is certainly true. On the other hand, the idea of the open text in the Middle Ages provides for the intriguing possibility that in the decades between, let's say, 1270 and 1310 or 1320, many, many different Kabbalists were writing and rewriting these texts, such that the number of different kinds of compositions that we have from different Mekubalim is actually very, very substantial. Many hundreds of different texts being written and rewritten by hundreds of different hands in the late 13th and early 14th century. That is certainly possible. In literally none of the texts that I have examined that are attributed by Sholem to the late 13th century, I've seen no clear evidence of these texts being later than that. You know, it's hard to know what that evidence would be, but I've seen no clear or obvious evidence that would suggest that these texts must be later. And it's certainly possible that these texts are constantly being reworked by different Mekubalim for a variety of reasons. Certainly, one common phenomenon we find is a text that will begin, and it looks like Yaakov ben Yaakov HaKohen's commentary on the 10 Sfirot. It looks like it for the first page. As you read into it, you'll find that these texts differ significantly from one another, such that it really seems like they are different texts written by different Kabbalists for their own reasons. And they'll be cataloged as Yaakov ben Yaakov's Perush on the 10 Sfirot. But it's not. There are actually many texts that are cataloged that way, and that's not what they are. They just start that way. And because the cataloging system is based on how the text begins, there's actually much more variation in these texts than even the catalogs would indicate. And the catalogs would indicate we have hundreds and hundreds of texts, over 500, that are like this. So it's an interesting question. If we can locate these texts somewhat in the late 13th and early 14th century, it raises interesting questions not so much for how we understand Kabbalistic symbolism and theosophy. I don't see any major novelties or differences in how these texts describe Kabbalistic ideas. It's largely consistent with texts that we already know from the late 13th century. It's consistent mostly with what we know from the Zohar, Yosef of Hamadan, Yosef Gigatila, De Leon, these sorts of things. What is interesting, though, is considering what this body of literature tells us about the historical intellectual context that made the production of this kind of discourse possible and desirable. Because it would seem that not only was it possible for people to describe the world in a Kabbalistic way, but it was desirable. And that this was a mode of imagining Judaism that was embraced and repeated by many, many different Jews in this period. That raises some interesting questions in terms of the historical and cultural impact of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages, and some of the ways that Kabbalah is articulating a cultural logic that is engaging the contemporary world in which Jews lived. So in terms of this question of how widespread Kabbalah was, and what that tells us about the way Kabbalists engaged their historical context, the way that Kabbalistic texts provide evidence for us for how Jews imagined themselves within their historical context. I would emphasize that I'm primarily interested in this in terms of understanding Kabbalah as a kind of discourse. And the degree to which it reflects historical realities is a little bit difficult to say. But it is certainly informed by the way that medieval Jews understood themselves and perceived themselves and tried to imagine a meaningful place for themselves in the world. The fact that Kabbalah succeeded as serving as a paradigm for how Jews conceptualize the meaning of rabbinic Judaism is actually very counterintuitive. We wouldn't expect that this way of imagining Judaism would be embraced or accepted by so many Jews in the Middle Ages. In fact, Kabbalists make very bold claims that they have a secret tradition from Sinai, and that on the basis of this secret tradition, which constitutes, as they argue, the true inner core of the meaning of Torah, the meaning of mitzvot, all of the rabbinic system, that this provides a new way, but the true way and the ancient way that God intended for Jews to understand what Judaism is. In a sense, they're advancing a new kind of oral Torah. Though it bears many affinities with the rabbinic tradition, it certainly is something that was a novelty throughout the 13th century, yet it was enthusiastically embraced. And so this raises interesting questions, leaving aside the issue of whether or not Kabbalah is the revelation of an ancient tradition or the medieval production of a new ancient tradition. It's certainly the case that the creation of Kabbalistic discourse, especially in the form that we find it in these Kabbalistic Varia, is a relatively new phenomenon, and that it stakes out some fairly bold claims about the nature of its authority based on a claim to esotericism, to a Torah Hasod, a secret form of knowledge. And it would seem that this claim to authority was embraced fairly enthusiastically by a rather large number, or at least a potentially large number, of medieval Jews, depending, again, what we do with this interesting but problematic evidence of anonymous manuscripts that we have in our possession. In thinking about this question, about how new forms of discourse are possible and what that tells us as evidence for the religious productivity of a particular time and place, I'm interested in things like Jonathan Z. Smith, who has argued, famously described religious myths as what he calls, quote, a strategy for dealing with a situation, a strategy for thinking through a particular aspect of a human condition. And that religious mythologies are, in a sense, a kind of map in which people create or imagine a map of the world and imagine a place for themselves on that map. And Kabbalah certainly does that, and it does it in a distinctive way. The question of how it succeeds in providing a map of the world in which Jews occupy a powerful and central place, but based on knowledge that is conveyed through an ancient secret tradition, I find it interesting to consider Talal Assad's argument that regimes of power and regimes of truth create the parameters, the possibilities for advancing new forms of discourse, and they preclude other possibilities. Some kinds of discourse become possible, other kinds of discourse become impossible in a certain historical moment. Bearing that in mind, it's interesting to consider the context of late 13th and early 14th century Castile in particular, but the Iberian Peninsula more generally. We see a number of things happening that I want to touch on just briefly before getting to the text that I brought for today. One, of course, is the role of esotericism in the Alphonsine Renaissance, in the Renaissance of Alfonso X, the wise king who quite prominently associated his attempts to gather knowledge, in particular from the things that are described in the documents that address the Alphonsine Renaissance. He seeks to gather lost forms of knowledge, secret forms of knowledge. and bring this together by drawing scholars to his court and, in a sense, retrieving lost ancient forms of knowledge, thereby advancing his claims to a broader empire. This seemed to be an association that was made in medieval Iberia between gathering lost ancient forms of knowledge and making an assertion to power, legitimacy, and authority. And while it was certainly the case that the rational sciences were also something that Alfonso X was very active in patronizing, he was also interested in all kinds of sciences, in astrology, in various forms of magic. We know from a letter later in the 14th century from his nephew, he describes Alfonso's court as one where even the Kabbalah, which Jews carefully guard, is something that he sought to gather, to translate. In the introduction to the Lapidary, a book written under Alfonso's patronage on the mystical and magical properties of stones, there it describes in the introduction that Alfonso found this text because it was kept secret by a Jew who didn't want anyone to know about the power hidden in this text. The text apparently was written in Arabic, but it was so cryptically written that no one could decipher it. So Alfonso had another Jew, his doctor, it seems in some cases. His doctor was a trusted associate of Alfonso, who was also Jewish, who translated the text for Alfonso, and this becomes the Lapidary. And this is one of Alfonso's earlier works. So it's interesting that in that one piece of evidence, there is the image of a Jew as a repository of secret knowledge, and the image of yet another Jew as the key to unlocking that secret knowledge. Now again, this is only one little piece of historical evidence. The court of Alfonso X was not the only important cultural influence for Jews in the Middle Ages, but as a piece of evidence, it raises interesting questions about how Jews may have been, how Kabbalists may have been tapping into or employing the modality of esoteric knowledge, of secret knowledge that is revealed from some divine source rather than derived through logical, rational means. Because this was something that was a mode of truth authorization in the Middle Ages that Jews could make use of, especially since they could claim to have the revelation on Har Sinai as the origin of their esoteric knowledge. And what we find in many of the medieval Kabbalistic Varia is they are very self-conscious and deliberate about describing where their knowledge comes from. And they are emphatic that it is not rational knowledge, but instead it's knowledge that derives from Mount Sinai. It is divinely revealed. It's passed on secretly through a Shalshelet Kabbalah known only to Jews. And so they create a way of imagining Jewish authority and Jewish legitimacy. Now the other, in addition to questions about anxieties about rationalism, which I think may have been an important and was an important motivation for how Kabbalists articulate an esoteric conception of Jewish knowledge, and that this modality of esotericism was common in the broader culture in which Kabbalists participated. I think it's also important to consider the stimulus of Christianity, both in terms of Christian anti-Jewish polemics against Judaism, and just the general presence of Christianity as a challenge that Jews, including Kabbalists, had to think about when they sought to construct a way of imagining Jewish legitimacy and authority. I was thinking about this a lot because once I had a conversation with Professor Lasker, I don't know if you remember, at the Association for Jewish Studies conference, and I had been writing about the early works of Zhigatila and how he seems to address certain aspects that were part of the argumentation of medieval Jewish-Christian polemics. And the question is, how much are they responding to polemics and how much are they responding sort of generally to Christianity? And you pointed out that it's much easier to demonstrate a response to Christianity rather than to particular points of polemical texts. And I found that to actually be a really interesting model for thinking about how Kabbalah is constructed as a kind of counter-theology in which they very deliberately stress their differences from how Christians imagine Jews and how Christians stake out Christian authority. Kabbalists create a kind of Jewish authority that I think is deliberately described in a way that is designed to make it immune to the claims that Christians make about the illegitimacy of Judaism in a couple of different ways. First of all, if Kabbalah has an esoteric origin, you can't really argue that it's rationally incorrect. You can't argue that it's based on a misreading of biblical or rabbinic texts, because Kabbalists will always say that the true meaning of those texts can only be understood through the Torah Hasod, and that any attempt to read them through any other mechanism, even in Hebrew, reading them any other way is misguided, because it's not based upon the foundation of the oral Torah Hasod from Har Sinai. And that kind of argument, I think, has a deliberate politics to it. It has a polemical response to a way that Christians generally both seek to specifically criticize Judaism, but also it's a response to Christian claims to legitimacy by creating a counter-response of a particular Jewish claim to legitimacy. So these are the kinds of themes that, just mentioned very briefly, are common in these texts. I want to read through a few examples of things that I've transcribed from manuscripts where we see these kinds of issues coming up. I have 4 different things that I've taken from manuscripts that are passed around. As we go through these, we can discuss them. You can feel free to ask questions. And we'll just start with the first one. This text is from an Oxford Michelangelo manuscript from the 14th century. It's in an Italian script. And Sholem refers to this text as, Gershom Sholem describes this in one point as a text from the, I think he calls it the students of the school of Girona. So it's from somehow the later students of the Chug Girona. So it's difficult to say how early this text is. I will say this text seems to be potentially a little bit earlier than some of the commentaries on the 10 Sfirot. This text has no title. It's in some catalogs referred to as a Mamar al ha-Kabbalah ve'ha-Philosophia, whatever that means. And the formulations in this text are reflective of ways that the relationship between Kabbalah and rational knowledge is described in many, many anonymous Kabbalistic texts. So this is one representative example. So in this first text, we read the following. It says, Ve'ein safek lo kedivrei ha-Philosophim. This was actually in the context of a description of angels, and whether the Malachim and the Schalim and Ifradim are the same thing or not. And so the author says that it looks kind of like philosophy, but be careful, it's not philosophy. So he says, Ve'ein lehamshich achrei divreihem shehem rechokim mikol kavanat rabotenu mikubal ha-nevi'im yodea dat v'din mipi ha-nevuah velo mishikul hadat v'ha'anyanim kamase merkava v'sitrei Torah kabbalot beyadenu mipi ha-nevi'im umipi Moshe Aharon. He is missing, but it's Aharon. Kulam roeh pnei hamelech. I'm sorry. It could be. In the manuscript, it is written as a resh without the hey. So either way, there's a problem. It could be. It would make more sense grammatically if it was Adon Kulam, but it could be Mipi Moshe. It's a little strange either way. In these transcriptions, I've preserved all of the strange orthographic anomalies, strange spellings. I tried to do it exactly as I found it in the manuscript. So whoever roeh pnei hamelech asher ne'amar bo peo pei adaber bo ve'ein leba'al shikul hadat ve'anshei hayun chelik bezeh. So here we have one example of a text that stakes out a distinctive territory for Kabbalistic knowledge. And this is something we find over and over again. They are very, very clear and deliberate in arguing that Kabbalistic knowledge cannot be derived through any kind of rational speculation. This isn't to say that you don't need to think about Kabbalistic secrets. There's still a hermeneutical process at play, but they argue that the foundation of this knowledge is prophetic revelation and not any kind of rational speculation. Here they're departing very distinctly from some medieval philosophers who would place a higher value on rational demonstration than they would on knowledge that is known through tradition. Maimonides makes arguments similar to this, though it's worth noting that even in many medieval philosophical texts, they argue that philosophy itself was stolen by the Greeks from the prophets, and they try to project back onto prophetic history philosophy as an originally Jewish science. But still, the idea of a science and rational knowledge as the origin of truth regarding the divine realm, Kabbalists in most cases reject this and argue that rational speculation is incapable of arriving at Kabbalistic knowledge. The only way to acquire it is to be taught by your teacher, to read it in a Kabbalistic book, to be part of the chain, the secret transmission of Kabbalistic ideas. But what that secret is, and how to understand that secret, is an interesting question. So in the second text, we see a different and somewhat more complex description of this secret knowledge. This is a sort of beginning paragraph of a commentary on the Ten Sfirot that's preserved in a British library manuscript. Margoliot says this text is probably 16th century and a Hispano-Oriental script. He doesn't know much more about the origin of the text than that. And it's an interesting text in that it begins as though it's the words of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It says, Amar Hechacham Harav Hagadol B'Chochma Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Zatzal Ani me'id alai be'edut brura she'elu hadvarim hem divrei Elokim Chaim v'divrei HaKabbalah shehayu mekablim chachmei hadorot meyom shnigna haTorah v'Sinai ve'ad achshav ve'ein bahem ela yichud Hashem yitbarach v'yitalei ve'emet ve'emunah ve'kol elu ha'inyanim she'ani kotev hem kochotav u'midotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu וכל אלו המרמזים אינם נגלים אלא למשכילים רודפי צדק מבקשי אדוני והם צריכים להסתיר מעיני ההמון אשר נסך השם בקרבם רוח עיבים. That's from Isaiah 19:14. כי תמצא שרז"ל אומרים הרבה בתלמוד שאין הדת סבלתו ולכך כתבתי זה לשבור פי הדוברים על הצדיקים עתק כי דברי רז"ל הם דברי אלוהים חיים והם נאמרים על דרך הקבלה, שאמרו ז"ל הקדוש ברוך הוא מניח תפילין, ושהוא מתפלל, ושהוא שועה כארי, ושהוא בוכה, ועניינים הרבה הדומים לאלו. וחלילה חלילה, כי מי שאמר והיה העולם יתברך ויתעלה, יש בו דברים הללו. אלא שבהם סודות גדולים ונוראים, והיודעם אסור לו לגלותם, אלא למי שיש בו דעת מיושב, כי עיקר העיקרים ויסוד היסודות באלו הספירות הם תלויים, ואדוני אלוהינו ירצנו ויורנו דרכיו הישרים, למען נהיה לעבודתו ולא נחטא, amen ואמן. So here again, the esoteric origin of this knowledge is clearly stated, that they are revelatory. This text also makes a somewhat playful use of the image of Rashbi here, because not very further on in this text, it starts to cite people like the Ramban. So how exactly the author could imagine that Rashbi is citing the Ramban, I mean, I think that they were somewhat playful with the pseudepigraphic categories. But the idea that there's an esoteric knowledge that is revealed through prophetic tradition, and that knowledge should be restricted, these are discursive strategies that the text makes recourse to. But I would argue that the claim to restricted knowledge, that this knowledge should not be shared with any who have this ruach ivim, this spirit of distortion, I don't take that to mean that this knowledge was actually restricted. I think that there is a claim that the knowledge should be restricted, but it's part of the way that such knowledge is authorized and actually disseminated. There's a promulgation, an opening of the distribution of this knowledge that's implied by the claim that this is knowledge that is so valuable that it should be restricted. And other people have talked about this as well. Halbertal has talked about this, that the claim to secret knowledge is often an assertion of authority in order to try to more broadly disseminate that knowledge. And this claim here, I think, is making that kind of claim. It's asserting the authority of this knowledge, but the idea that the knowledge should be restricted is not actually, I don't think, an historical reality. I think the goal was that this knowledge should be spread among Jews, and that part of how it's marked or identified as valuable is by claiming that it's knowledge that should be restricted and secret. And of course, this text is very clear that it involves a project of rereading rabbinic literature. That things that are described in rabbinic literature that bother the philosophers also in many respects bother Kabbalists. They're just as uncomfortable with a literal rendering of these kinds of images of the divine, a divine who is anthropomorphically and anthropopathically described having human physical attributes, having human emotional characteristics. The text here says that, of course, these things are true, but al derech hasod. So they don't engage in philosophical allegory, but they do engage in a kind of what I would call a Kabbalistic arcanization, a Kabbalistic claim that there is a secret that renders these statements meaningful. So this kind of strategy for reimagining Judaism, we find this frequently in these texts. Maybe we'll just move through the other texts and then we'll discuss them. So the next text is a text from the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's a 15th century text. It's actually it's dated 1413, the year 1413, and it's in Italian script. This is a commentary on the 10 Sfirot that talks about the process of creation in the following way. It says, "Kishabara HaKadosh Baruch Hu et olamo, v'shisha yamim bra'o, v'hashvi'i nirmaz b'hei ha'achrona shebashem." So that all seven are somehow captured in the 6 days of creation. Ve'otam shiva yamim hem nikraim sheva spirot hamekablot megimel spirot elionot hem keter chochma bina. Ksharatza lekayem olam hatachton chavaroto be'olam ha'elyon lechaber et ha'ohel lehiyot echad ushmo yitbarach miuchad mala umata bara ba'aretz hatachtona shiva tzadikim keneged shiva yamim elyonim V'chol echad remuz bo sheva lehiyot kalul mikulam. It says a little bit further on in sort of the continuation of this idea of the 7 days and the 7 righteous men. It says, "V'hatzadikim halalu machnisim shalom bein Yisrael le'avihem shabashamayim. V'ashrei umah hagdosha sheyesh lehen praklitin ka'elu umah she'enanu mazkirin betfilatenu ela Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov lefi shehem klal kol ha-shivat tzadikim she'amdot lahem le'Yisrael." So here the notion of creation is mapped onto the idea of the 7 days of the week, the 7 sfirot that are below Keter, Chochma, and Bina, and the 7 righteous men who serve as the defenders of Israel. And what we find is their description here, and there are many, many such similar things that we find in these texts, a description in which the very fabric of the cosmos itself and the fabric of the Godhead, the sfirot, are understood as the defenders of Israel. There's a sort of assertion here of the centrality of the people of Israel as a divine concern, and the notion that Israel has its defenders. The text, of course, talks about how the sinfulness of the people of Israel has led to their historical exile, but throughout these texts there's an anxiety about what is the meaning of the Jewish tradition in the context of exile. Do they have protectors in the divine world or not? Do the mitzvot matter or not? And what we often find is they argue that not only do they have their divine protection, but that in fact the very fabric of the cosmos itself would cease to exist were it not for Jews performing Jewish law. In the absence of that, the Godhead would become separated and torn asunder, and literally the fabric of being itself would cease to exist were it not for the people of Israel. They are the central, most important aspect of creation that holds everything together through the practice of rabbinic law, and that they are defended in this respect by aspects of the Godhead itself. So again, this is a very articulated, deliberate assertion of rabbinic authority and Jewish legitimacy, but using this claim to a secret form of knowledge as the source of that description of rabbinic power and meaning. In the last text, and this one is found in a JTS manuscript dating to the 16th century in what they call an Oriental Script. This is one of the texts that starts off like Yaakov ben Yaakov HaKohen and then is totally different as it goes along. That was categorized, it was cataloged as one of his commentaries. This is one version of a comment that is often included in the commentaries on the Ten Sfirot in their Perush on Malchut. In the Perush on Malchut, they often have something kind of like this. I've found it in many different forms, some of them quite different. And this is one interesting example of the kinds of things that we find them saying about the structure of being and the place of Israel in the world. This one argues, with regard to the Kala, or Shekhinah, Malchut, it says, Ba'avur shekala zo sho'evet mehakol, mitchabeket imo, ve'az yitbarchu ha'elyonim ve'hatachtonim, u'masos chatano kala. Ve'im chas v'shalom, nifredet az, cherev Adonai me'oreret makot, ve'onashim u'shvatim gedolim, u'beit din shelo yitbarach ragav yapo. U'midah zo yarshu Yisrael, vehi nachalatam, shene'emar zot nachalat avdei Adonai, u'midah zo nifred le'Yisrael mikol shchenehem. U'biyot Yisrael b'Yerushalayim, b'tchunat Beit HaMikdash ve'keila v'tzirotav, ve'hayu kol hadvarim mitachtim lemino, az kol hasfirot lamala, ve'habracha nimshechet la'olam. U'kshacharva Yerushalayim lamata, miparda chavila hatachtona, ve'in em shan kohen, miparda chavila b'Yerushalayim ha'elyona, nifredet v'shchinas ruya b'galut im Yisrael. Ve'az nitbatla habracha hayoredet mishemen hatov, which is usually in this text a reference to Chochmah. Lefikach amruzal, ein lachayom she'ein bo klala meyom shecharav Beit Mikdash. V'zehu sod shekol hadvekim b'Shem mitoch dibuk u'machshava be'eser sfirot az be'tem hadvekim b'Adonai Elohechem chaim kolchem hayom. V'zehu sod hayichud b'boker u'ba'erev la'agi b'boker chazdecha be'emunatcha b'levot. V'kol ha'me'ached ha'anafim b'shoresh ve'yaleh hasfirot b'aguda echad tamid az devak b'Hashem yitbarach v'sfirot elu atidot lachzor b'haviatan ve'yot Beit HaMikdash kayam v'haya hashalom shalem v'hakisei shalem v'kol ha'me'ached sfirot elu et Hashem yitbarach nikdash b'kedushato v'kol ha'mafrid echad mehem lavad alav ne'emar v'nirgan mafrid alu. So this describes an image of the place of Jews in the world that's common from medieval Kabbalah, but is condensed in a way that I think was designed to be reader-friendly. It was designed to make these ideas more broadly accessible by imagining that, especially with the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the world will be in a state of perfection, bracha will flow down, there will be a proper shefa through all of the tzinorot into the world, and that's how being should be, but due to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the world is in a flawed state, and it's one that Jews have to work to overcome through the performance of Jewish ritual. And that this way of imagining the world is reflected in this Sphirotic tradition of the Kabbalah, which is known through the ancient mysteries revealed by God, which even this text begins with, as we saw with the others, with the claim that such knowledge is accessible through tradition and inaccessible through rational speculation. So, again, the theurgic impact of medieval Jewish law, the theurgic impact even of the study of Kabbalah, here this idea that through the contemplation of the 10 Sfirot, the divine world can be perfected and blessing can be brought into the world. This empowered way of imagining Judaism, how widespread was it? And how much can these texts tell us about how reflective this is of a substantial discursive shift, meaning a shift in the ways that Jews talked about and imagined Jewish meaning in the Middle Ages. Is this a 13th and early 14th century phenomenon, or do these texts indicate something later? So questions that I find very intriguing. My intuition is that what we see reflected here is an enormous diversity of Kabbalistic discourse that generally is from the late 13th and early 14th centuries. But again, the texts don't make it, the sources don't make it easy for us to demonstrate that conclusively, beyond the fact that known texts from the 13th century, Jikatila, de Leon, all of the sort of common suspects, project a similar image that's similar to these, and that's similar to anonymous texts that we can date from earlier manuscripts. Perhaps we'll find more manuscripts. I understand from Sandra that there are some in the Hebrew University Library that are still uncatalogued. Hopefully we'll be able to find more evidence. But it raises interesting questions. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how we grapple with some of these methodological questions, and what evidence like this can tell us about medieval Kabbalah and medieval intellectual history more broadly.
Well, thank you very much.